Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
That wasn't Santa on our rooftop. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I like that you have so many creepy stories from Pennsylvania on your show. I'm partial to those because I lived through one, and I'd like to tell it to you. It's a story about the Pennsylvania Dogman, so I think it would fit in with what you do. I like to tell my kids this story when we go to visit their grandma, aka my mother, who still lives in the house this all took place in and above and around. It quiets the kids down, and they don't dare misbehave when we get there. Meanwhile, my mother still to this day knows nothing about any of this. No point in telling her about it now. She's got a weak heart. This happened on Christmas Eve when I was a kid, and my brother was also a kid, but 1 year younger than I was. I don't remember exactly how old we were, but we were young enough to still be totally into Christmas. That year, as every year, we were put to bed early so that our parents could get everything ready for Christmas morning. They used to put up the tree, wrap the presents, put up decorations, everything the night before, then tell us that Santa did it and that it was magic. I already knew it was them doing it, and so did my brother Sam, but we acted like we believed them because we knew it mattered so much to them. Sam still believed in Santa, though. He just thought he shared the responsibility of Christmas with our parents, and that it was a joint effort. I was cynical about the whole thing, and felt that Santa probably wasn't real. I was still hoping something would change my mind, but there were just too many illogical plot holes in the Santa story, including the whole idea of coming down the chimney. So each year at Christmas, my parents would avoid inviting our depressed Aunt Margaret, but each year she would call them crying and saying she was going to self-delete. So my parents would inevitably give up and invite her over to depress us all on Christmas Day. This year was no exception. Margaret called. We could hear the loud argument downstairs as my father insisted that his sister-in-law had no right to ruin Christmas for his kids every year, and so on and so on. Other families repeat the same old Christmas records each December. Ours would repeat the same old arguments. Mom and Dad came up to our bedroom and looked in on us, so we pretended to be asleep. We heard them talking to each other, saying something like, "They're both fast asleep. We can drive over and get Margaret and be back without them even noticing we were gone." Once they left, we knew we had about an hour before they got back. That was 1 full hour to sneak around to see what presents we'd be getting the next morning. How do you think I found out that it wasn't Santa doing the decorations? Because this same thing happened every year. So as the two of us wandered around, oohing and eyeing at what presents we were going to have to act surprised about in the morning, something happened that year, which was different from any other year. Sam noticed it first, and he pointed it out to me. There was someone walking around on our roof. I listened, and there really was. It sounded like a heavy person, too. My heart lit up. Would I be proven wrong about Santa Claus after all? Sam was certain that's who it was, and he ran out of the house onto the front lawn to see. I followed, unable to believe this was actually happening. When I saw my brother looking up at the roof and smiling, I wondered why his smile turned to a look of confusion, and then of horror. When I got to where he was standing and looked where he was looking, I screamed. That wasn't Santa on our roof. It was some sort of a werewolf, a hairy, naked animal that stood up like a man on its hind legs. It was looking into our chimney, but when I screamed, its attention was diverted to me and my brother Sam, and that was when Sam fainted dead away. I tried to get him up, but I couldn't. I was starting to get cold in my pajamas, and the werewolf was staring at me, edging down the slanted roof in my direction. I started to hyperventilate. I wanted to run inside and save myself, but That would mean leaving my younger brother outside to either be eaten by the upright walking canid or to freeze to death in the cold. I loved my brother back then. I didn't know what a louse he would turn out to be when he grew up. In those days, I'd have given my life to save his for what that was worth. I stared up at that werewolf, and I begged it to please leave us alone. I met its eyes, and I pleaded for the lives of myself and my brother. I thought that I could see understanding in the Dogman's eyes. But then, it leaped down off the roof and bared its teeth at me. This creature was taller than my father, and had rows of long, sharp teeth and a snout that was big enough to take my head off in one bite. It took one step toward me, then another, and I began to accept that it was all about to end for me. It had been a good life, I told myself, because I remembered a character in a movie saying something like that once. Actually, I had no other life to compare it to, so I didn't really know if I had lived a good life or not. I remember noticing that the creature walked on legs just like our neighbor's golden retriever's hind legs. It was far heavier than that animal, though, and its claws seemed far longer and scarier as well. I wondered if it would tear me apart or just eat me alive, but I didn't get a chance to find out. My parents' headlights swerved into view, and that Dogman was suddenly not there. I don't know which direction it ran to, but it ran there fast, that's all I know. As soon as the scene was lit up, he was out of there. That left me and my brother Sam, who was still lying face down and unconscious on the front lawn in his Spider-Man underoos. It turned out my mother had forgotten something and demanded my father drive back to allow her to pick it up, so they were both in surly moods, even before they saw my brother lying there, looking as though he were deceased. I did some fast thinking and claimed that Sam had gone sleepwalking, and I was following him. My mother actually believed me, and I was quickly off the hook for committing Christmas spying crimes. Mom got us both jackets and threw us in the back seat to go get Aunt Margaret. Sam woke up on the way there, groggy, thinking we were going to the drive-in movies. I felt incredibly guilty for lying about what happened to my mother, but she wouldn't have believed the truth anyway. I suppose I'm writing this as a sort of a confession. I know my kids believe the story, though. They have to sleep upstairs in that house tonight, and I know the idea terrifies them. If they hear footsteps on that roof, there's no way they're gonna think it's Santa. Not since I told them the story of the night that my brother Sam and I discovered that wasn't Santa on our rooftop.
Need a last-minute gift for a Dogman fan? Well, listen up, friend, I've got your plan. A feature-length special you'll always remember, only seen before by our channel members. Dogman, no, let's go! The bloody werewolf! I saw a Dogman eat a truck! Dogman rules, he got the funk! Christmas, Kwanzaa, Hanukkah too, it's a perfect gift for you, and you don't gotta wait to see it. The digital download is completely immediate. It's not disgusting. Werewolf Stories Christmas digital stocking stuffer for only $5 American. The perfect gift for the werewolf lover in your life. Link is in the description.
Dogman versus Krampus. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Right after the end of WW2 in Germany, in a bus or a truck or some sort of vehicle that was transporting a bunch of GIs back out of the war zone, my grandfather told me he saw a fight between Dogman and something that I would describe as Krampus. Grandpa was on the beginning of his journey back home to my grandmother, and they were about to have my father a year later. Even though Germany immediately after the war was still somewhat dangerous, it was officially over, and these guys were among the first who were going to be getting to go home. The men were tired but jolly, and they were singing sing-along songs from back in America. Suddenly, the entire vehicle bounced off the road, as though there had been a large explosion or impact very close by. The driver was one of the only people who could see what was actually happening, and he pulled to a stop. The men piled out of the back and came around the sides, only to discover something out of a giant monster film, the kind that would become so popular in the 10 or 20 years after this event. The well-trained military men took defensive positions and aimed their weapons at the display in front of them. They were ordered to hold fire until told not to, that they were only to use force to defend their position. And what were they defending their position from? Before I get into that, I think you should understand that I was told this story when I was a kid, back in the 90s, by my grandfather himself. If the whole Krampus thing had started up yet, I hadn't heard about it. And this was not told to me as a Christmas story either, although I do tell it to my kids each Christmas. Grandpa never said he saw Krampus, and he never said he saw a Dogman. Grandpa told me that he and his fellow GIs saw, battling hand to claw in the middle of the street in Germany, I think in or near Berlin, what he described as two very large, primeval cavemen. One of the oversized men, he said, had antlers or horns on his head, not like a deer, but something more like a goat or a ram, but very large and formidable. He also said that the goat-like man had hooves on his feet. His face was very human, but with a horrible expression like that of the devil himself. Some of the men began to pray, believing that they were in the presence of the Lord of Darkness himself. This creature or devil was not colored red, as in the popular media of that time, but Grandpa said instead it had bright white fur, long, wavy, and shaggy, like a sheepdog. That was the fur on the head. The fur on the body was dark and long. The other monster battling there was a dog-headed demon, according to my grandfather, equally covered in long fur. This one was more of a brownish or reddish hue. According to Grandpa, this one appeared taller than the other, but he stood more upright, with the Krampus-like monster bouncing around in a more ape-like fashion, bent over at the waist. The Dogman looked like a human in most ways, but this was a feral human at best. Both creatures appeared savage and prehistoric, and Grandpa said that some of the guys were really thinking that this was the end of the world or something. They thought they had seen everything. They thought the war was over, and then here was this situation they were having to deal with that nobody on the planet could have ever prepared for. Grandpa retreated against orders to the truck and got himself some gas masks. He reasoned that they might be hallucinating this entire situation. Maybe there was some drug released into the air that was making them all just think that they were in the middle of a giant monster flick. Some of the other men had been thinking the same thing as him, and they eagerly put the gas masks on. But the two monsters were still battling there in front of their disbelieving eyes. When I was a kid and I was told this story, I imagined that the monsters were 15 or 20 feet tall, but I don't actually remember my grandfather ever saying anything like that. I didn't see an entire truck of soldiers being phased by two 6-foot-tall guys having a fist fight in the road. For them to have pulled to a stop, they must have been huge. They must have blocked the entire road. Everything that he said implied that. Grandpa never said they were driving through a narrow alley and this battle caused them to stop. He said there was an impact that caused the entire vehicle to bounce off the ground, and then the driver stopped. That implies that those monsters must have been large enough that they could cause minor earth tremors in the immediate area of their fighting. So maybe they were even bigger than I imagined. According to my grandfather, the Krampus man would lower his head and charge forward on all fours, somewhat like a bull, trying to run headlong into the more upright Dogman, and that each time the Dogman would time his leap, either jumping entirely over the Krampus or else landing on the goat creature's back and snapping at his face and throat before inevitably being thrown to the ground and beginning the cycle all over again. It became quite violent. Grandpa mentioned rivers of blood flowing into the sewers that night, but none of it was human. The creatures smashed into the side of a building, causing a cascading effect that weakened the integrity of the next few buildings on the same block. The tops of these structures began to crumble and rain down on the street as Grandpa's commanding officer ordered them all back onto the truck. While the Dogman and Krampus battled off to the right, their driver navigated the falling stones and drove them to safety. To Grandpa, this was his final battle of the war. He laid down his weapons and never picked them up again. My grandfather was not a very wild or crazy kind of a guy. He really didn't have any other good stories besides this one. His second best story was how he found out that the bear trap in his basement was worth $500 on Antiques Roadshow. He wasn't a drinker. He didn't exaggerate. He rarely drew attention to himself, and he never heard of Krampus in his lifetime. I personally only found out about Krampus in the 2000s, a few years after Grandpa had left us. Of course, he was the person I thought of first when I saw Krampus. It looked exactly like what Grandpa had told me he had seen. I think Krampus is supposed to have one human foot and one hoof, but other than that, his description was really dead on. Of course, I never heard of a giant Krampus before or since, so maybe that's not what it was. But what else comes close to that description? Maybe Goatman? Or possibly some kind of devil or demon. Grandpa also never heard of Dogman as far as I know, and he never called the creature that, or werewolf. It was always a giant dog-headed caveman that stood upright and tall. Not an upright walking canine, but a caveman with a dog head. So it's just my opinion, but I think this actually happened. And I think it happened in the middle of the summer. But I tell it to my kids each year at Christmas. This year I was supposed to tell it to our youth group at church, but the event got canceled due to the government's crackdown on religious gatherings. The church asked me to tell it on Zoom, but I would really rather wait and hope that next Christmas is not ruined on purpose by the powers that be, and that we are allowed to exercise our basic rights of freedom of assembly and freedom of worship in our own country once again. If not, then you may have just heard the only public retelling there ever will be of my grandfather's tale of Dogman versus Krampus. Dogman's Shack. Dear Scary Stories NYC, when I was a kid, my friends and I used to gather to play in my backyard, and we often wandered off into the forest behind the yard. Our parents gradually allowed us to venture further and further from home, until one day, when I think I was 16, we went deep enough into the woods to discover the strangest, tiniest little shack. It was built out of cheap wooden boards, and it looked like it had been put up quite a long time ago. From a distance, it only looked like it could hold one person at a time, so at first we thought it was an outhouse. What's that old outhouse doing here in the middle of nowhere? When we got closer, we could see that it was about the size of a medium-sized closet, and all four of us could fit inside, as long as one of us stood outside and leaned in. There was nothing on the inside of the shack except a really old-looking Arabian rug that smelled horribly. It had gotten wet and dried so often, it smelled like dead everything by this point. We looked around and found absolutely nothing else inside the shack, so we were about to leave. That's when I noticed the floor in the middle of the room had more bounce to it than the floor by the edges. It also sounded sort of weirdly hollow when I kicked at it. I told the others we should lift the rug up and look underneath, but nobody wanted to help me. I rolled my eyes at their laziness and grabbed a corner of the rug to pull up. All of these tiny white and gray bugs that had been under the rug raced out in all directions, including up my arms. I screamed and ran outside, trying to get the bugs off of me. Some of them ran inside my clothes. It was gross, and I itched all over. While I was dealing with the set of issues that this had introduced, one of my friends started shouting at us that there was a trap door under the rug. Now the others joined forces to lift the nasty old rug and throw it out of the shack. The trap door was unlocked and opened easily, revealing a ladder leading down into the darkness. We couldn't see the bottom of the ladder, but none of us hesitated in immediately climbing downward. This was by far the coolest thing that we had ever found in that forest or anywhere else. Those were the very early days of cell phones, and either we didn't have flashlights on them, or we didn't realize yet that we did. One of the guys had a little flashlight on his keychain, and that provided all our illumination. At the bottom of the ladder, there was only one way to go, and that was a primitive tunnel that stretched out further than our light. We started walking down in that direction, excited but quiet. We were aware that a loud noise underground could lead to a cave-in. We had learned that from the TV. Plus, I can't speak for the others, but I had the weird vibe that someone or something might have, at least once, lived down there. If we didn't run into someone alive, we might run into their remains. I wanted to explore until the keychain light started to go out, then split out of there and maybe come back the next day with better flashlights. We actually wandered for a while, but there was never more than one way to go. It was all one long, winding, curving tunnel. Sometimes it was level, sometimes it was steeply uphill, and sometimes we slid down faster than we wanted to. We finally reached a fork in the tunnels and had to decide whether to continue left or right. Our friend with the keychain flashlight argued for neither. I have to hold this down to keep it on. My finger's getting sore, he whined. Besides, the battery's gonna go any second, and I don't want to be stuck down here without a light. That second thought sent a shudder through me, and I was about to second the motion of us heading back when I heard a sound. It was a dog-like sound, but it sounded like an unfriendly dog. Or maybe it sounded like a feral dog. I looked down the tunnels, both the left and the right ones. In both, I could swear I was making out eye shine in the darkness. I could only see it with my peripheral vision, but it looked like 3 or 4 dogs, or wolves, or coyotes in the left tunnel, and at least as many in the right. I could see them clearly in my side vision, but when I would look directly, I could no longer see the eye shine. Without the growling, angry dog noises, I wouldn't really be sure that I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. I suggested strongly to the others that we should split up. One of them started to disagree with me when I swear this thing jumped out of the shadows, landing a few feet from us. It was not a dog, or at least not a normal one. It was standing on its hind legs, and it was continuing to proceed in our direction. We ran and climbed over each other to get out of there. Even in the pitch black, there was only one way to go, and that was the way we went. I remember crying, thinking that we were all gonna die. I remember thinking I'd never taste my mother's awful meatloaf again, and how my little brother would never annoy me again either. All the things I used to hate. Now I wished I could trade this moment for any of those. I wept for boring Saturdays with no plans. I cried for the chicken pox. I even cried for my homework. While I was feeling sorry for myself, I was also running like a lunatic. And when I saw the light coming from the ladder and entrance, my tears turned to happy ones. All of us made it out of the hole, but we looked like total wrecks. None of us had fallen less than twice down there, and we were filthy from head to toe. Our clothes were torn and our hair messed up, but we didn't care because we were alive, living on borrowed time. We had been foolish to go down there unprepared, and at that point I was so happy to breathe fresh air and to see the waning light of the sun. We all headed back to my house, and when my mother saw us emerge from the woods, we got quite a shouting at. She demanded to know what had just happened, and, not having had time to create a mutually agreed upon fake version of the story to tell adults, we just spilled the beans. We told her every detail, from start to finish. She looked pretty concerned, and she told us to go inside and wash up. Then she started making phone calls. After we were washed, she was still preoccupied on the phone and wouldn't explain to us who she was calling. That night, my brother woke me up and called me over to the bedroom window. I looked outside, and my mom was there with my father and a number of the adults in the neighborhood. They were all acting weird and very serious, talking about something too quietly for us to hear upstairs. Then they went off into the forest in a group, shining flashlights ahead of them. The two of us tried to sit up, waiting for them to come out of the forest, but we both fell asleep and woke up when the sun rose. I had a bad pain in my neck from the way I had fallen asleep in the chair, but I had never heard or seen anyone come out of the forest. I could smell breakfast coming from downstairs, though, so I knew my mother was back, and that my brother and I had better get ready for school. So that afternoon, after school, my brother joined my friends for a trip to the Dogman shack. This time, we each had a nice big flashlight, so we felt we were thoroughly prepared for our adventure. When we reached the shack, though, we found it burned to the ground, rug and trap door included. And now the latter hole was filled with rocks of all sizes, from boulders down to pebbles. It looked like it would take a year to excavate that hole and get back down it. That must have been what the adults were doing in the forest the night prior. They must have been closing off this hole. That meant they knew about the shack, and they knew about the hole with the ladder in it. Probably they knew about the Dogman. What else did they know that they weren't telling us? To her dying day, my mother refused to tell us anything about that hole or the Dogman. She denied having gone into the forest that night, and denied knowing anything about a group of adults burning the shack down. She insisted she thought we made up the story of the shack to cover for having gotten ourselves so dirty. Even on her deathbed, when she knew she was going to pass on, she still refused to admit that she knew about any of this. So, as scary as that Dogman was, and as terrifying as our near miss with death was, the fact that my mother refused to ever let loose with even one secret about that underground tunnel system seems like the most frightening part of this story to me. What could be down there that would be so much more terrifying than the Dogman which we had already seen? What was that tunnel system? Where did it lead? And what did it have to do with the parents of my old neighborhood? Now that my mother is gone, these are questions I will never know the answers to. In fact, the only one with answers about that place is the Dogman. Underneath Dogman Shack. The day after Hanukkah, Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Happy day after Hanukkah, everybody. I may be the only person in the world who celebrates the day after Hanukkah. Well, me and my older brother both. But we do it because it's the anniversary of when we saw the Dogman. For some reason, my mother decided that we had to visit our Tante Bela on the last day of Hanukkah each year. She didn't leave us anything in her will anyway, but Mom was convinced that we had to pay tribute to her on the final day every year. This particular year, it had posed a hardship for Tante Bella to even have us out there, and that led to my father arguing with my mother the entire drive out, then Tante Bella acting annoyed toward all of us while we were there, and finally my parents arguing as we began a long drive home. It sucked knowing that we had bothered the woman we had been trying to suck up to. Each year, my parents would give my sister and myself very small gifts each day of the holiday, but they would save up the good gifts for the final day, when we could open them in front of Tante Bella and, I guess, impress her or something. This year, we were driving home, having put the presents back in the trunk unopened as we got kicked out because Tante Bella wanted to have people over that she actually wanted to have there. It was pretty embarrassing even for us kids, so I can only imagine what it was like for my parents, and they tore into each other verbally as we drove away from the place. Now, when my Uncle Shlomo passed on, Tante Bella moved way, way, way out of Brooklyn. The town she lived in was called Dauphin, Pennsylvania, and it took around 3 hours of driving each way to get out there and back to Borough Park. That was on a good day, when my parents weren't arguing. When they were going at it like they were on that date, my father would miss every turn-off, blame my mother, get her screaming, then miss another turn-off, which he would blame on her once again, keeping the ball rolling down the hill, then up the next one. It was like a record set on repeat, if any of you know what a record is or was. I don't know where we were, and I don't know if either of my parents knew either, but it started to get dark, and we still seemed to be out in the country somewhere. Dad was sure, he claimed, that if we continued along this narrow country highway, lined on both sides with snow-covered trees packed tight to the edges of the blacktop, that it would lead to a way to get back on the toll road. My parents knew how to get home by paying tolls, but they were lost once they got onto local streets or wherever we were. My mother was incapable of holding her fears back, and she had to express the possibility that things could go wrong as often as she could, and with as much detail as possible. If Dad said this road would take us back to the highway, Mom would point out that it was possible Dad could be wrong, and that the road might lead us even further from where we needed to be. She wouldn't say that based on any map reading. She wouldn't even touch a map. She just wanted to point out that my father was just as likely wrong as he was right, and that we should always remember this. I'm not sure why she did it, but she never didn't do it, so it must have been meant to serve some purpose. My older brother was sort of the same way, but different. He would imagine nightmare scenarios, then tell us about them to get us worried about things that might happen, instead of allowing us to live in that moment or be happy. Sure, you think everything is fine, but you know what? Fate could be laughing at you. A rock slide could come down that tall hill to the left and crush this car with boulders. He'd point out that sort of thing. On this day, as it darkened into night, he started talking about all the kinds of weird people that might be in a dark forest in the country. Imagine there was a guy walking right there along the road, he'd say. Maybe he was carrying a big hammer. Why is he there? What if he asked us to stop and pick him up? We'd all yell at him to shut up, because he would really start to get us creeped out. He'd never quiet down, though. He'd always double down on it like, well, what if you sped up to get past the creepy man? And then he jumped on the hood of the car and screamed at us. We'd all shout at him again, while he asked us over and over, no, but seriously, what would you do if it happened? Seriously, what would you do? I'd like to say he grew up to be a great horror movie director. But actually, he inherited my parents' apartment and is retired. He never married or had any children, but he has a very large collection of independent underground scary movies. His motto these days is, never stream, always buy hard copies. He emails me when good old movies are re-released on disc, but we don't talk much other than that these days. Back then, we already called him the Spook Master, because he could make anything seem scary. If I had to go to the bathroom at night, he'd be like, dude, imagine you went down the dark hallway to the bathroom, and in the darkness, You felt fingers touching your feet. What would you do? No, seriously, what would you do? Eventually, we realized it was past midnight and was now officially the day after Hanukkah, and we were not home yet. Not only were we not in Brooklyn, but we weren't sure where we were. That might sound strange to say these days with GPS and so forth, but this was a long time ago, and we had neglected to even bring a paper map with us. We had seen no signs on this long, narrow road through the dark woods in well over an hour. My brother asking what we would do if a ghost appeared in the car with us, or what we would do if we saw a Bigfoot staring at us from the woods, had thoroughly creeped all of us out. My parents were clearly now very afraid, as they had not said a mean word to each other in several minutes. We didn't know where we were. We didn't know where we were going. And, to answer my brother, we didn't know what we would do if we saw the Dover demon outside either. And then, we saw something way, way worse than the Dover demon. When teenagers saw that monster, they chased it. When we saw what we saw, my father slammed on the brakes and began driving in reverse. Because right there, in the middle of the thin road, stood a 7 or 8 foot tall dog that was standing on its hind legs. Or maybe it wasn't a dog. Maybe it was a man with a dog's head. It was too thin in the belly area to be a human in a costume, and the lower legs appeared too thin as well. The fur was gray, or at least looked gray in the headlights. It was patchy in places, as though the creature might have mange. The immense chest and broad shoulders looked human, sure, but still, it just could not have been. The ears were on top of its head, and they moved around like dog's ears. This was not a Bigfoot, and this was not a tall human. It was something else, and I think if the story happened today, it would definitely have been called a Dogman. This was a genuine situation, like the imaginary ones my brother was always posing to us. What would you do if all of a sudden there was a 7 or 8 foot tall naked werewolf standing in the road? No, seriously, what would you do? I screamed. So did my brother and mother. I already told you that my dad hit the brakes, then put the car in reverse. And do you know what the Dogman did? The Dogman ran toward us. That made my dad scream louder than any of us. The creature sped up, still running on its hind legs. Dad sped up too, driving at crazy speeds backward, wobbling the car back and forth and left and right, unable to steer well backward and watch the monster running at his face in front of him. I was as afraid that we were going to smash into a tree as that we would get eaten by the Dogman, to be honest. I did not consider my father a very good driver, at least not under stress. I remember that this was the first time in my life that I prayed without an adult telling me to. I prayed for us to get out of this uninjured, and for us to sleep in our own beds before sunrise. I remember thinking that we had to be doing 40 miles an hour backward, but that Dogman was still gaining on us anyway. And then, the inevitable moment came when the creature overtook us and bounced with both feet on the hood. We all screamed and I ducked down in my seat. And then I heard the Dogman running over the car and off down the highway behind us. I got up to look, and sure enough, the creature was racing incredibly fast, off into the night and out of our lives. Dad slammed on the brakes, then collapsed on the steering wheel and bawled openly like a baby. My older brother snickered at him. Then my mother lectured him that a real man cries, a real man is not ashamed to cry, and that he should only hope he grows up to be a man like his father, who can cry openly in front of his children. Then Dad told Mom to shut up, and the two of them were off to the races once more. One of the benefits of being a kid was that I fell asleep sometime after that in the back seat. These days, An event like that would keep me from sleeping for over a month. But back then, it wasn't such a big deal to get over. The day after Hanukkah, Dogman. Up next, we've got multiple stories all taking place within a fairly close proximity of each other, all in Pennsylvania. This first one happened to a young, romantic couple as they attempted to break away from society for a few days of heart-shaped bathtubs and champagne glass beds. They would find their efforts to find luxury and privacy thwarted by the Dogman. This is an all-new story submitted by one of you, and we've decided to call it Weekend Getaway Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this is a story about myself and my wife back before we were married. We were looking to get away for a weekend to do something different and exciting, but private and romantic. She started singing the old Beautiful Mount Airy Lodge TV commercial jingle, and we both joked about going there. After looking the place up on the internet and discovering that it was real and it still existed as a casino, we started actually considering it more seriously. It's one of those places with a heart-shaped bathtub and a bed shaped like a giant champagne glass, really corny in a sort of Austin Powers kind of a sense, but then it dates back probably to that era or close to it. Before you knew it, we were on our way to our kitsch, romantic weekend getaway. The problem was, nobody told us we'd have to get past Dogman to arrive there. We had driven all the way out from Staten Island and the traffic had been light. Both of us were still in good moods even though we'd been driving for quite some time. We were traveling along Route 80 in that part where it treads the border of Pennsylvania and New Jersey for a few miles, just before you pass through the Delaware Water Gap. It's the part of the highway named after Christopher Columbus, and to the right, you pass the Lakota Wolf Preserve. We were the only people on the highway at that point, and to be honest, it felt like our private vacation had already started. We were kissing and canoodling. My then girlfriend and current wife was driving. Let's call her Sandra, which is not her real name. Oh, I just remembered how she hates when I tell this story. Oh well, hopefully she won't be listening. Okay, we were looking at each other while driving on the highway at night, and that's not something you should be doing. See, this is why my wife does not like me talking about this. She was the driver, so I suppose she should have been the first one to notice the 8 or 9 foot tall dog-headed man that had just walked out onto the road in front of us. I screamed and pointed, and Sandra started shouting at me never to raise my voice to her. She still wasn't looking out the windshield, and that's the second reason she hates me retelling this story. "Hit the brakes," I screamed, and Sandra finally noticed the large figure standing directly in our path down the highway a bit. She hit the brakes. She swerved the steering wheel. She did all she could to get out of the path of the hairy Dogman standing directly in front of us. The problem was, whichever way she turned, the Dogman walked that way too. If she adjusted to avoid hitting him, he adjusted to get back in her way. By this point, we were both screaming. We realized there was nothing either of us could do to avoid the inevitable. Wherever she aimed the front fender as we screeched to a halt, that creature was still going to be in front of us. We sped directly at the monster. I remember it had a deep gray fur coat all over, a uniform deep gray. Its nose leather was a bit darker at the end of a long snout. Although the head was canine in shape, the eyes bore an intelligence in them as they reflected the car headlights so much that they almost seemed to be lit from inside the creature's skull. I couldn't understand why something so obviously intelligent would be willing to needlessly sacrifice itself in this way. We didn't want to hit it. Why wouldn't it get out of our way? And then we braced for the moment of impact. It was going to happen no matter what we wanted to do to stop it. And as the car flew down that highway toward that immense, dog-headed man, he simply hopped up onto the front hood and jogged over us as we continued screeching to a halt. When the car stopped, the engine joined it in chugging to a complete collapse. We sat there in the middle of the highway absolutely still. I think the car lights were still on, but I'm not sure. We were both crying and my heart was beating so fast. It was the loudest thing in the world to me at that moment. We looked behind and couldn't see the monster anywhere. Sandra told me to get out and look at the engine. I asked her what the heck I knew about car engines, and she started to scream that I didn't care if she lived or died. I urged her to just wait and let the engine cool down. Then I was sure it would start again. That idea didn't satisfy her, so she popped the hood from inside and sat there glaring at me. I knew I had no choice but to go out there where the Dogman was still waiting around. I just decided to get out there and do it as fast as I could manage. The second I emerged from the passenger seat, a gust of freezing cold wind hit me, and I really regretted booking that romantic weekend getaway. I opened the car hood and looked at the engine, but like I said, I don't know anything about car engines, and this was just Sandra punishing me. Why would she be punishing me? I don't know. I guess because she wasn't watching the road when she should have been, and that's my fault. I was pretending to look at the engine, but I really was looking around me in all directions. And then I saw it. I saw the Dogman. It hadn't left. I knew it hadn't left. And there it was, staring at me, standing upright by a tree down the road and staring at me. It stood fully upright like a man. It had long, shaggy hair, but I would say the body was relatively humanoid. The next thing I noticed was that the creature was no longer standing still and staring. It had begun to walk bipedally in my direction. Panic gripped my entire body. I pressed down on that hood and almost slammed my finger in it. My entire body froze up and became unintelligent. I shivered all over so violently, it was difficult to get the hood closed and get back in the car. I got my door locked and tried to tell Sandra to drive. She was saying something, but I didn't know what. My brain wasn't functioning much better than my stuttering mouth. I think I passed out around that point. Since I'm still alive, I presume Sandra drove out of there before the Dogman ate us. I don't know the exact details because, as I said earlier, my wife doesn't really like to talk about this subject very much at all. In fact, she's never told me the rest of what happened on the night that we ran into the weekend getaway Dogman. This next one took place just a bit further west than the last one, about a 20 or 30 minute drive from the Lakota Wolf Preserve, is a little street with a famously scary name, Elm Street. Only this person who wrote us didn't tell us a story about seeing Freddy Krueger. He wrote us a story about claiming to see a nightmare off Elm Street. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I grew up in the suburbs in Pennsylvania and I had 3 best friends. We can call them Manny, Mo, and Jack. We had started to drift apart a little in our teenage years when Manny got a car handed down to him through his family. We all started hanging out in and around his car and the various places it could take us, and the four musketeers were back together. We were roughhousers to some extent, but we never did anything too bad, and we never got arrested or anything. We did get a bit wild, and we liked to have fun though, that was for sure. We would play jokes on each other a lot, quite often pretending that we saw a monster to try to get one or more of the others to get scared for real. So, on this one night, when Mo insisted Manny pull the car over, we all thought he was kidding around. We thought it was a prank to try to scare Manny. So, he pulls the car over and we're on the corner of Elm Street and Milford Road, which is where the 209 bus runs during the day. We would call it MILF Road, but that's only because we were idiots. There weren't any more or fewer MILFs on that block than any other. When Mo acted genuinely scared and pointed toward the trees set down away from the edge of the property across the street, I joked that it was an army of MILFs coming to get us. But then I saw that there really was someone or something down there, and I craned my neck and strained my eyes to get a better look at it. Whatever it was walking among the trees and acting weird, like its motions seemed abnormal and out of place. I'm not sure what it was doing. It was bending in odd ways. I'm not sure how to describe it better than that. I found it unsettling. It seemed insane, or maybe like something that walked in from an insane dimension. We opened the car doors and stood outside, trying to get a better view. It was scary, watching that tall thing doing whatever it was doing, but it was off so far away that it was hard to even know what or who it was. Something happened just then that made the situation one whole hell of a lot scarier. The thing darted out onto the lawn, apparently running toward us. We all jumped back into the car with the intent of speeding out of there. So, of course, the car didn't start. Time slowed down to a crawl. My friends were all freaking out, trying to shout over each other. I looked to see whose doors were locked or not, reaching up, under, over, and through each of them. I locked every door. The windows seemed sealed up too. If we had to, we could withstand a pummeling from that creature. Hopefully the car would start before that happened, but I felt a bit secure in the short term. Now, while the others continued to scream and bounce around, I watched the creature approaching us with great haste. This was an animal out of fiction. It was a monster from a myth. Its eyes glowed in an unnatural way. Its movements all seemed backward, yet sickeningly graceful. I felt as though we were witnessing a human dog, or the son of a dog. I felt nauseous at its existence. The car engine started and all other sounds melted away from my ears. I watched as, out the window, the dog-headed man-thing faded further and further back into the distance and into my past. I'm happy to say that I have not ever seen that creature again, and I hope never to. I still become frozen with complete gripping fear each time I think about the nightmare off Elm Street. Hey, you guys packed up yet? We're leaving Elm Street now and heading a bit further west for our third story of this trilogy. There are bogs over there. Miles and miles of nothing but wet nature. Plenty of space for a large land predator like the North American Dogman to call home. We have one more Pennsylvania Dogman sighting to tell you about, and it's a story we call the Cranberry Bog Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story about encountering a dogman one night on the drive home from a day spent out in nature. My girlfriend and I had gone on a tour of the Cranberry Bog Reserve that's over on Cherry Lane Road. It was really educational, but we also found it peaceful, as the bog itself was so quiet. We went in with some romantic notions about nature, but came away with the realization that nature is one big machine, eating itself over and over all day and all night. Every part of the forest eventually gets eaten by all the other parts, then is reborn and eats the others. That's doubly and triply true in swamps and bogs and wetlands. There were all kinds of animals all living off of each other in that bog. A fascinatingly weird and surreal picture was painted for us by the tour guide of a dog-eat-dog and frog-eat-frog kind of a world. We no longer felt that light elevator music sense of peace in nature. We now felt a much deeper sense of abject awe at the unending beauty and simultaneous horror of every single thing that happens in the natural world. So I suppose we were in a good philosophical state of mind that night to run into the Dogman. We sat in the parking lot after the tour, letting everyone else leave before us. We got into a conversation about the heavy feelings that had sort of been laid on us by the tour guide, and before you knew it, hours had passed, and we realized we'd better get going home. I was driving, and we were only about 2 blocks away from the parking lot itself. It had gotten dark, and there was no other traffic. To our left, as we drove away, was the natural area. Just trees and swamp and bog and water and mud and quicksand and animals eating cranberries for miles and miles and miles. I found myself feeling as though the entire forest was watching us. Or maybe I should say I felt as though everyone in the forest was watching us. I began to feel my face getting warm as though I were blushing. It was so strange how strongly I felt as though the forest were staring directly at me. My girlfriend was suddenly screaming, and I thought a spider had walked in her lap or something at first because I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary on the road. So I took my eyes off the road to look at her, only to see her staring out the front windshield with a horrified expression on her face, pointing forward. That was when I turned and saw the most incredible thing I likely will ever see. There was a dog standing there, but not just any kind of dog. This was like the Tyrannosaurus Rex of dogs. This was a large-headed monster of a dog, and it was somehow managing to walk on its hind legs. It had exited the forest and was now crossing the road. It had noticed us and was looking directly at us. Its eyes reflected back the light from our headlights incredibly brightly. The Dogman was gone into the trees on some private property across the road before we reached him, and that was the last we saw of the creature on that or any other night. I can't honestly tell you what color it was, but it was dark and monochromatic. It was tall, and it had dog-like ears on top of its head, which means it was not a Bigfoot. That's one thing my girlfriend and I both agree 100% on. This was a dog-headed, hairy humanoid. It was not a bear, and it was not a Sasquatch. We both know what we saw, and what we saw was the Cranberry Bog Dogman.
The Full Moon Killer. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this is a true story, but most of it you would not be able to prove. The one part you can suss out if you're a good enough detective is who the killer is that I'm referring to in this story. That's because this was a serial killer who always committed his crimes the week of the full moon. I have a strong conviction that this man was a werewolf, and that is why his particularly savage murders took place around that time of the month. In fact, I lived through an attempt on my life made by this man-wolf, so I know what I'm saying. The problem is that the facts of this case have been brushed under the rug, and I've been threatened with persecution from a fairly high level if I go public about any of this. The short version is, they don't want John Q. public to understand that werewolves are real. This way they can use it to take us out and take us down anytime they want to. And anyone with real proof who tries to show that to the mainstream, they'll get cut off pretty quickly. I'm sending this to you anonymously, but even so, I'm nervous about what I'm doing. If you want to present this as fiction, I won't argue with you. Maybe that would be more prudent. This man, this killer werewolf, he was once a man on the rise in a certain community. He never achieved much notoriety, but that's because he was given the werewolf curse before he could achieve any prominence. Now he's notorious, that's for sure, but it's for the trail of blood and bodies he's left behind. Look, I saw the thing when he was in his werewolf form, and I had seen him acting crazy while he was still barely human, I think. It would be impossible to forget. He was dressed as Santa. It was pretty obscene, really, just sickening. Now, the way I remember this story starting was that this monster got out of his mental home. He had to hurt people to get out, but he got out. Then he started heading toward the town I used to live in. I didn't move all that far away, just on the other side of the woods from where I grew up, from where my dad still lived. Now, you know how in all the movies when a psycho killer is on the loose, it goes out on the radio and so forth. Everyone is notified that a dangerous killer is lurking nearby, right? Well, if the killer is a werewolf, it seems that none of that happens. People's lives are not worth as much to those in power as protecting the secret information about werewolves, for whatever reason. I am not privy to enough information to tell you why this is, but I know that it is. They don't want people to know that this is a real problem. When a werewolf gets out, it's easier to clean up whatever mess he creates than to alert the public that werewolves are real. The first time I heard about the full moon killer was when my father called me on the phone and told me that he was on the loose. It seemed that Dad had a connection at that mental home. They called him on the phone as soon as the guy escaped. I asked Dad why he cared and why I should care, but while I was talking to him, I could hear a struggle begin on the other end. When the noise stopped, I heard the phone pick up and I shouted into it, asking my father if he was all right. The voice on the other end told me my father was fine, and that he was coming to see me right now. Then the phone hung up. The problem was, that was not the voice of my father. I got on the phone to the police, and I told them my father's address and that I heard him being attacked. While I stayed on the line, the woman on the other end asked me a lot of questions, and I tried to fill her in on the situation. My father seemed very concerned about a certain man escaping from a certain institution. And then I heard him being attacked, and it was at that point the dispatcher started connecting different bits I was telling her into one big picture. I remember she asked me how my father knew that this individual I named was on the loose. She seemed to know that the public was unaware of all this, but she seemed to know exactly who I was talking about. It was at that point that the phone line went dead. It seemed completely gone. I couldn't get any dial tone. Before I could think of what to do, someone's hand covered my mouth, and I found myself being dragged into the back room. When I got tossed into a chair, I could finally see my attacker. He was the single ugliest man I had ever seen. But in fairness, he was in the beginning of the process of transforming into a werewolf. I couldn't tell that at the time because I didn't know werewolves were even real. This guy was in periodic bits of pain and discomfort, during which he would shout like he had Tourette's. And I thought at first that was his problem, but no, he was becoming a werewolf. and I eventually saw him fully transformed right there in the room with me. He spoke in a halting manner about stuff that I found just crazy. This monster dressed as Santa Claus told me that he was my real father. The man who took me in and raised me was not my dad. He isn't even related to me. This werewolf man dressed as Santa had gotten my address from my dad. He had come here to me through the woods, and he said he had escaped from that institution just to see me. I had no idea if he was telling the truth, but I knew he had escaped from an institution, so I just humored him, biding my time and waiting for a chance to escape. Suddenly, the entire world exploded, as both the door and the window to the room got kicked in. I was ordered to lie flat, and the police pumped that wolfman who claimed to be my father full of lead. He fell backward into the wall. Then I heard him laughing, and he stood up like nothing had happened. Three men in uniform stepped forward with what must have been early versions of tasers, and that seemed to work to drop the creature to the ground. A man in a suit knelt down and injected the monster with something, and then some policemen moving with military-like precision grabbed the beast, wrapped him up in a tarp, and carried him out the front door of my apartment. I accepted a certain sum of money which I needed to repair my apartment and my life, and in exchange I can't talk on the record about any of what happened. Dad is fine. He was knocked unconscious by the werewolf, but not seriously injured. He told me not to believe any of the lies the monster man told me, and so I don't. Dad said this guy was my late mother's first husband. I was born after Dad married Mom, so Dad must be my father and the other guy must just be crazy. Dad says the guy isn't evil, though. He was just driven mad by the werewolfism. Dad is a good man and he told me to forgive that man, but never to believe him or trust him. After all, the guy we're talking about here is the Full Moon Killer. I hope you're keeping warm and, well, I hope you join us in thanking Stell. Tonight's executive producer is Stell Cordova, who joined our PayPal subscribers club through peterbernard.com. That means she gets to see our weekly secret uncensored Dogman and werewolf stories, and so can you. Here comes our international TV spokesmongrel Henry Lee Dogman to explain the deets. Hank?
Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/peterbernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.